The silence in the Grand Archives was a physical thing, a weight of processed air and dormant data that settled over Elian's shoulders like a shroud. It smelled of ozone, cool metal, and the faint, papery ghost of information stored on crystalline slates that had long since replaced paper. He ran a gloved finger along the edge of a data rack, the smooth, cold surface offering no purchase, no texture, no life. It was the perfect metaphor for the enclave itself, seamless, sterile, and utterly devoid of friction. Here, history was not a story, but a data set, catalogued and sanitized. Here, he was not a person, but a function. Scribe, Omega class, designation 7B. His own biology was a footnote in a file he was not permitted to access, a primal legacy deemed inefficient by the Enclave's architects. He wore suppressants that leached the scent from his skin, that flattened the delicate cyclical tides of his own nature into a placid, predictable shoreline. He was a ghost in the machine, and for 26 years he had learned to prefer it. Ghost did not feel. Ghost did not want. Today, the silence felt different. It was not peaceful. It was expectant. A low hum vibrated up through the polished composite floor, a sub-audible thrum that resonated in the hollows of his bones. The summons had come an hour ago, delivered not by a standard communique drone, but by a member of the Alpha's personal guard, a stoic beta whose uniform was so crisply starched it seemed to whisper with every precise movement. The message was simple, stark, and terrifyingly irregular. The Alpha requires a scribe, Spire, level 99. You. Not a request, a command. The Spire was the seat of power, the needle-thin tower that pierced the perpetual grey overcast of the city's atmospheric ceiling. It was the home and command center of Alpha Kalen, the architect of their placid world. Level 99 was not on any public schematic. It was a myth, a blank space in the city's otherwise perfect map. And he, Elian, a creature of quiet archives and muted senses, was being called into the void. The journey was a study in escalating sterility. The public transit slid silently through its vacuum tube, but the private lift to the Spire ascended with a silence that was absolute, a void of sound that made his ears ache. The guard stood opposite him, his gaze fixed on the space just above Elian's head, his presence a block of granite. Elian focused on his own reflection in the mirrored walls of the lift, a pale, narrow face with eyes that seemed too large, his scribe's uniform a simple, unadorned sheath of grey. He looked like a sketch, an outline of a person waiting to be filled in. He saw the faint tremor in his hands and tucked them into the sleeves of his tunic. Fear was an inefficient emotion, a biological artifact. He recited the Enclave's first tenet, the words of familiar, smooth stone in his mind. Order is purity. Purity is peace. The lift did not chime. It simply stopped, the change in momentum, a subtle lurch in his gut. The doors slid open not onto a hallway, but directly into a vast, white space. The room was circular, impossibly white, the light seeming to emanate from the very walls, floor, and ceiling, leaving no shadows. It was a disorienting, absolute luminescence. In the center of this void stood Alpha Kalen. He was not looking at Elian. He was turned away, his attention fixed on a large, circular lens embedded in the far wall, a dark eye in the face of brilliant white. Kalen was tall, his frame defined by the severe black lines of his command uniform. He was the antithesis of the room he occupied, a slash of darkness in a world of blinding light. Elian had only ever seen him in sanctioned broadcasts, a figure of calm authority and remote power. In person, That power was a palpable force, a pressure against the skin. His scent, even through the room's aggressive filtration, was a low, resonant note of ozone and something colder, like glacial ice. It was a scent of absolute, unshakable control. The guard behind him gave a slight, almost imperceptible nudge, and Elian stepped forward, his soft-soled shoes making no sound. He stopped a respectful 10 paces from the alpha, lowered his head, and waited. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. The hum was stronger here, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to be coming from the very air. "Scribe," Kalen said, his voice a low baritone, calm and measured. He did not turn. "Your designation is 7B. You were top of your class at the Institute. Specialization in pre-enclave historical redaction and biological data curation." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, recited from a file, Elian's file. "You are noted for your precision, your discretion." The slight pause before the last word was unnerving. "I have a task that requires both." Kalen finally turned, and the force of his gaze was physical. His eyes were a startlingly pale grey, the color of a winter sky, and they held an unnerving stillness. There was no emotion in them, only assessment. He gestured to a small, unassuming panel on the wall, a seamless square that Elian hadn't noticed. "I need you to access and collate a private data stream. It is old, corrupted. The encryption is archaic. It requires a delicate hand. Your hand." Elian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, primitive drumbeat. A private stream, archaic encryption. This was not a sanctioned task. This was something else entirely. "The terminal is through here." Kalen pressed his palm against the panel. With a faint hiss of displaced air, a section of the white wall slid away, revealing not a room, but a dark, narrow corridor that seemed to absorb the light. The air that drifted out was different. It was thick, heavy, and carried a scent that made the back of Elian's throat tighten. It was organic, alive, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was the smell of sweat, of musk, of something feral and unsanitized. It was the smell of everything the Enclave had sought to erase. Kalen's pale eyes watched him, gauging his reaction. There was no order here. There was no purity. There was only a cold, prickling dread. "Proceed, scribe," Kalen commanded, his voice holding that same chilling calm. Elian looked from the Alpha's unreadable face to the dark maw of the hallway. He had no choice. He was a function. He was a scribe. He took a breath of the clean, sterile air of the white room, holding it like a diver about to plunge into a dark, unknown sea, and stepped across the threshold. The panel hissed shut behind him, plunging him into near-total darkness and sealing him in with the suffocating, primal scent of a secret he was never meant to discover. The corridor was short, no more than a dozen paces, but it felt like a mile-long descent into the planet's core. The darkness was not absolute. Faint blue light bled from seams along the floor, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things. The air was warm and humid, clinging to his skin, a stark contrast to the refrigerated atmosphere of the rest of the spire. The scent was overwhelming now, a complex and terrifying bouquet. It was the raw, unfiltered scent of an Omega in distress, sharp with panic and slick with need, a scent he hadn't experienced since childhood, before the suppressants had muted his world. But layered beneath it, darker and more potent, was the unmistakable scent of an alpha. Not the controlled, glacial scent of Kalen in the white room, but something else, something possessive, dominant, and edged with a violence that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. The hum was louder here, a vibrating, guttural growl that seemed to be the source of the terrible sense. He followed the corridor as it curved, his hand trailing along a wall that was not smooth and cold, but strangely pliant and warm, like skin. The corridor opened into a chamber, and the sight that met him stole the breath from his lungs. It was a laboratory, but a perverted, hellish version of one. The room was circular, like the one before, but its walls were a dark, bruised purple, veined with pulsing blue light. In the center, suspended in a web of crystalline conduits and humming machinery, was a glass containment cell. And inside the cell was a person, an Omega. The boy, he couldn't be more than 20, was curled on the floor, his body trembling, his face buried in his arms. He wore a simple white tunic, now stained and damp. Wires snaked from the machinery and adhered to his temples, his neck, his wrists, feeding glowing streams of data into monitors that flickered with chaotic, jagged lines. But that wasn't what made Elian freeze, his blood turning to ice. Standing before the cell, his back to the entrance, was a figure. It was Kalen, or rather, a version of him. He was stripped of his uniform jacket, wearing only a tight black undershirt that clung to the hard planes of his shoulders and back. The air of cold control was gone, replaced by a predatory stillness. The raw, violent alpha scent was pouring off him in waves. He was watching the Omega in the cell, his head tilted, an expression of intense, predatory focus on his face. This was the secret. This was level 99. Not a data archive, a cage, an experiment. Elian stood frozen in the shadows of the corridor's entrance, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Alpha Kalen, the symbol of purity and order, the man who had systematically dismantled the flaws of their biology, was here, immersed in the very primal filth he claimed to abhor. The Omega in the cell whimpered, a low, broken sound, and Kalen took a step closer to the glass. He placed a hand against it, his fingers splayed. "Inconclusive," Kalen murmured, his voice a low growl that was nothing like the calm baritone from before. The synthetic pheromones induce the cycle, but the cognitive dampeners fail to override the instinctual response. The subject degrades. He was talking to himself, his voice clinical, yet threaded with a dark, terrible frustration. He was not observing. He was testing. He was causing this. The Omega in the cell was not a person to him. He was a subject, an asset. Elian felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was rage, a pure, cold rage that burned through the years of placid obedience. He took an involuntary step back, his shoes scuffing against the floor. The sound was infinitesimal, but in the charged silence of the lab, it was a gunshot. Kalen's head snapped around. Its pale grey eyes, no longer still and assessing, were now the eyes of a wolf, blazing with a terrifying, feral light. They locked onto Elian, and in that instant, the world narrowed to the space between them. The predatory alpha scent in the room intensified, crashing over Elian like a physical blow, designed to force submission, to bring him to his knees. It bypassed his suppressants, tearing through the careful chemical walls he had built around himself, and his own long-dormant Omega instincts screamed in terror. His body wanted to fold, to cower, to expose his throat, but the cold rage held him rigid. He did not move. He did not look away. For a long, silent moment, they simply stared at each other. Kalen, the predator caught in the act, and Elian, the ghost who had seen too much. The surprise in Kalen's eyes slowly bled away, replaced by something colder, sharper. Calculation. The feral light receded, banked like embers, and the cool, controlled alpha returned, reasserting command over the animal within. He straightened up, his posture once again becoming the familiar, authoritative stance of the Enclave's leader. He smoothed a hand over his hair, a gesture of impeccable self-possession that was utterly chilling in its context. He looked at Elian, a specimen pinned under glass. There was no anger in his expression, no panic, only a profound, unsettling stillness. A finality. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Elian, his presence consuming the space in the small, dark lab. Elian's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but he held his ground, his chin lifted in a gesture of defiance he didn't know he possessed. Kalen stopped just before him, so close Elian could feel the heat radiating from his body. He looked down at Elian, his gaze sweeping over him, a complete and total appraisal. Then his voice, once again the calm, measured baritone of command, delivered the sentence. You were not meant to see this. A beat of silence, thick with unspoken threat. Now, you never leave. The world did not go black. There was no struggle, no crude violence. One moment, Kalen was standing before him, a monolith of contained power, and the next, a pressure bloomed at the base of his skull, a sharp, crystalline sting, and the dark, pulsing lab dissolved into a wash of static. Consciousness frayed not like cloth, but like a corrupted data stream, glitching into fragments of sensation, the lingering, foul, sweet scent of the captive Omega, the cold weight of Kalen's gaze, the deep, guttural hum of the machine. Then, nothing. He woke to the scent of clean linen and the soft, even light of a morning he could not see. He was in a bed, the mattress conforming to his body with unnerving precision. For a moment, disorientation was a thick fog. He was in his own quarters, late for his shift at the archives. But his own quarters were Spartan, his bedding coarse and functional. This was different. The sheets were impossibly soft, the thread count a decadent luxury he couldn't have imagined. He sat up, the sheet pooling around his waist. The room was vast, a suite of rooms really, furnished with an elegant, minimalist austerity that screamed wealth and power. A sitting area with a low couch and chairs upholstered in dark grey fabric, a desk of polished black wood. The walls were a soft, muted silver, and one entire wall was a window. He slid from the bed, his feet sinking into a plush carpet. He walked to the window. It was not glass, but a high-fidelity screen displaying a perfect, photorealistic image of the Enclave's skyline under a placid, dawn-tinted sky. It was beautiful, and it was a lie. He pressed his hand against the cool surface. There was no give, no temperature change. It was a projection, a digital vista in a sealed tomb. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the layers of shock. He was a prisoner. He spun around, taking in the room again. There was a door, a single, seamless panel in the silver wall. He ran to it, his hands searching for a seam, a handle, a control panel. There was nothing. It was a smooth, unbroken surface. He beat his fists against it, the sound a dull, unsatisfying thud. "Let me out." The words were a raw tear in his throat, a sound he hadn't made in years. The room absorbed the noise, its silent, luxurious surfaces, swallowing his desperation. There was no response. He was screaming into a void. Exhausted, he sagged against the door, sliding down to sit on the floor, his head in his hands. He was an asset. He was an experiment. The words echoed in his mind, Kalen's clinical assessment of the boy in the cell. What was he now? A witness, a liability, a problem to be managed. The rage from the lab had cooled into a hard, dense knot of dread in his stomach. He was trapped in the Alpha's personal domain, a gilded cage hung at the top of the world. A soft chime, melodic and unobtrusive, sounded through the room. A section of the wall near the sitting area slid open, revealing a small alcove. Inside, a tray of food sat waiting, a bowl of nutrient paste, a flask of water, and a small, perfect-looking piece of fruit. The door slid shut. It was a message. You will be cared for. You will be fed. You will not be acknowledged. It was the Enclave's philosophy of control, distilled and personalized. Provide for the body to imprison the mind. He stared at the food, his stomach churning. He wouldn't eat it. He wouldn't participate in his own captivity. The day passed in a blur of silent pacing. He examined every inch of the suite. The bathroom was a marvel of automated efficiency, with a sonic shower and a dispenser for hygiene products. A closet held several changes of clothing, simple tunics and trousers in soft, dark fabrics, all perfectly tailored to his size. Everything was provided for. Everything except freedom. As the false dusk settled on the window screen, the main door finally hissed open. Elian, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, shot to his feet, his body tensing. Kalen stepped inside. He was once again in his immaculate black command uniform, the picture of calm authority. He held a data slate in one hand. He did not look at Elian immediately, his gaze sweeping the room as if ensuring everything was in its proper place. His eyes noted the untouched food tray, and a flicker of something. Annoyance? Amusement? Crossed his features before being suppressed. "You have not eaten," he stated, his voice neutral. Elian said nothing, his jaw tight. He would not engage. He would not play this game. Kalen walked over to the desk and placed the data slate upon it. He turned to face Elian, his pale eyes pinning him in place. "This can be a simple arrangement, scribe, or it can be a difficult one. The choice is yours." "What do you want from me?" Elian's voice was hoarse. "I want what I have always wanted," Kalen replied, his tone even. "Order. Silence. You are a disruption to that order, an anomaly. Here you are contained. You will continue your work. I have transferred the archive's primary server access to the terminal on that desk. You will continue your duties as a scribe. You will be productive." The audacity of it was breathtaking, to imprison him and then demand he work. "I won't," Elian bit out. Kalen tilted his head, a gesture of mild curiosity. "You will, because your other option is the laboratory. You can be a scribe or you can be a subject. The choice, as I said, is yours." The threat was delivered with the same dispassionate calm as the rest of his words, and that made it all the more terrifying. The image of the trembling Omega in the glass cell flashed in Elian's mind. He felt a wave of nausea. Kalen saw the flicker of fear in his eyes, the slight falter in his defiant posture. He had won. He always won. "You are not a prisoner, Elian," Kalen said, and the use of his name was a violation, an assertion of intimacy that did not exist. "You are a resident, a permanent guest. Your world has simply become smaller, more refined. You should be grateful. Most would kill for this level of comfort." He gestured to the luxurious room. The dark irony was a bitter taste in Elian's mouth. He was a bird in a cage, so beautiful, It was meant to forget the sky. Kalen turned to leave. At the door, he paused, his back still to Elian. "Eat your food. An inefficient body leads to an inefficient mind." The door hissed shut, and Elian was alone again with the silent, screaming luxury of his prison and the cold, hard weight of the Alpha's final words. He was not a person, he was a resource, and he would be kept efficient until he was no longer useful. The days bled into one another, marked only by the changing light of the false window and the silent delivery of meals. Elian fell into a fractured routine, born of defiance and self-preservation. He did not touch the terminal on the desk. He would not work for his jailer. Instead, he spent the simulated daylight hours pacing the confines of his cage, a restless phantom tracing the perimeter of his world. He explored every facet of the suite, learning its rhythms, its automated hums, its sterile perfection. He learned that the air filtration system cycled every 17 minutes, a faint whoosh of displaced air. He learned that the temperature dropped by a single degree during the artificial night. These were the meaningless facts of his new existence, the data points of a life reduced to 4 walls. He ate, he had to. The first 2 cycles he had refused, a hunger strike that earned him nothing but a gnawing emptiness, and a visit from Kalen on the 3rd cycle. The Alpha had entered without ceremony, looked at the untouched trays, and then at Elian, who was slumped on the couch, weak and dizzy. "This is petulant," Kalen had said, his voice laced with a cold disappointment, as if Elian were a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "Your body is a system. It requires fuel. Denying it is illogical." He had left without another word, but the message was clear. His defiance was an inconvenience, not a threat. It was a bug in the code that Kalen was confident he could patch. So Elian began to eat, just enough to sustain himself. Each bite was an act of submission, a bitter acknowledgement of his powerlessness. Kalen's visits became a regular feature of his week, as predictable as the false sunset. He would arrive, always in the evening, always with a data slate, and speak to Elian as if he were a subordinate in a progress meeting. He would ask about the work Elian was refusing to do, his tone never rising, his expression never changing. Elian's response was always a wall of silence. He would stand, arms crossed, and stare at a point on the wall just past Kalen's shoulder, refusing to meet those chillingly pale eyes. He would make himself a stone, an object, something that could not be engaged with. At first, Kalen seemed content with this dynamic. He would deliver his monologue on efficiency and duty, place a new data slate or a book on the desk, and leave. The objects were a strange mix. Treatises on pre-enclave social structures, collections of redacted poetry, complex schematics of the city's atmospheric processes. It was as if Kalen were trying to furnish his mind as he had furnished his cell. But as the weeks turned into a month, a subtle shift occurred. The silence began to wear on the Alpha. Elian could see it in the minute tightening of his jaw, the way his gaze would linger on Elian for a fraction of a second too long. The stone was beginning to erode the water. One evening, Kalen deviated from the script. He entered and, instead of addressing the untouched work, he walked to the false window and stood before the glittering skyline. "I designed this city," he said, his voice softer than usual, reflective. "Every conduit, every residence block, every filtration unit, I designed it to be perfect. A closed system free from the chaos of the past, free from the biological imperatives that led to ruin." Elian remained silent, but he was listening. This was new territory. We were animals, Kalen continued, his reflection a dark shape against the city of light, ruled by scent and cycle, driven by instincts we could not control. It was a weakness, a flaw in the design. I corrected it. He turned from the window, his eyes finding Elian's in the dim light. You see my work as tyranny. I see it as salvation. You call that salvation? Elian's voice was a rasp, rough from disuse, but the words were clear and sharp. The sound of his own voice surprised him. Kalen's expression didn't change, but a new intensity entered his eyes. He had broken his silence. The boy in your lab, the one you're torturing, is that your salvation? The accusation hung in the air between them, stark and ugly. Kalen's composure was, for the first time, visibly fractured. A muscle in his jaw jumped. That is research, a necessary exploration of the failure points. To understand the disease, you must study it. He is not a disease. He is a person, Elian shot back, a sudden surge of heat flooding him. He is a variable, Kalen countered, his voice dropping, becoming colder, harder. As are you. But you are a different kind of variable. You are resilient. He took a step closer, his presence once again a palpable pressure. All my life, I have dealt with systems, with data, with predictable outcomes. You are not predictable. He was close now, close enough for Elian to catch the faint, controlled scent of him. But underneath the ozone and ice, there was something else, a flicker of something raw, something he had smelled in the lab, frustration, and something akin to curiosity. At that moment, as Kalen's gaze bored into him, Elian felt a strange, disorienting sensation. A wave of emotion that was not his own washed over him. It was a cold, sharp spike of loneliness, so profound and vast it felt like staring into an abyss. It was followed by a flash of an image, blurry and indistinct, a field of white flowers under a real blue sky. The experience lasted only a second, but it left him staggering, dizzy. He put a hand to his head. Kalen frowned, his focus broken. What is it? Nothing, Elian mumbled, shaking his head to clear it. But it wasn't nothing. In that moment of intense proximity, of shared, heightened emotion, a wire had been crossed. A connection had sparked in the dark. He had felt Kalen's inner world, and it was a desolate, empty place. The Alpha stared at him, his brow furrowed in a rare display of uncertainty. He seemed to sense the shift, the strange feedback that had passed between them, even if he didn't understand it. He took a step back, re-establishing the distance, re-establishing control. Your suppressants will need to be recalibrated, he said, his voice once again clinical, detached. There appears to be a malfunction. He turned and left without another word, the door hissing shut behind him. Elian stood alone in the center of the room, his heart pounding. It wasn't a malfunction. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was a connection. A flaw in Kalen's perfect, closed system had just appeared. And it was him. The incident left an echo, a subtle resonance in the space between them. Elian no longer felt entirely alone in his cage. There was a ghost in the room with him now, a phantom presence that tasted of ice and loneliness. He began to feel things that were not his own. A sudden, sharp pang of frustration while he was staring at the window screen, so potent it made him clench his fists. A wave of profound weariness that settled over him in the middle of the artificial day, making him sit down, his bones feeling heavy as lead. These were Kalen's emotions, bleeding through the cracks in their shared confinement. It was terrifying. It was also a weapon. For the first time since his capture, Elian felt a sliver of something other than despair. He had a thread, a connection to the man who held his life in his hands. And a thread could be pulled. He started to experiment. During Kalen's next visit, as the Alpha stood by the desk, outlining some new, pointless task, Elian focused. He closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of his jailer, and concentrated on the memory of the lab, on the raw, unfiltered rage he had felt. He pushed the emotion outward, a silent, psychic scream into the space between them. Kalen stopped mid-sentence. The data slate in his hand made a soft, clattering noise as he set it down abruptly on the desk. He pressed the fingers of his other hand to his temple. "The ventilation in this sector is inadequate," he muttered, more to himself than to Elian. His voice was tight. Elian opened his eyes. He could see a faint sheen of sweat on the Alpha's brow. It had worked. He had affected him. A small, dangerous thrill went through him. Kalen composed himself quickly, straightening his tunic, his mask of control slipping back into place. But his eyes, when they met Elian's, held a new, sharp suspicion. He knew something was wrong, even if he couldn't name it. The visits grew shorter after that, more tense. Kalen seemed reluctant to stay in the room for long, as if the very air had become hostile to him. But he kept coming back. It was a compulsion, a need to observe the anomaly he could not control. Elian, in turn, grew bolder. He learned to shield his own thoughts, to present a placid surface while he carefully probed the connection between them. He wasn't just pushing his own emotions anymore. He was learning to listen. He would sit in meditation, filtering out the hum of the suite and focus on the faint, distant signal of the Alpha. He began to get more than just raw emotion. He got flashes of memory, sensory fragments untethered from context, the smell of rain on dry earth, a scent that did not exist in the Enclave's climate-controlled reality, the rough, warm texture of an animal's fur, the sound of laughter, two distinct voices, one of them a younger, less guarded version of Kalen's, and one image, recurring and persistent, the field of white flowers. It was always the same, a vast, windswept meadow under a brilliant, open sky, a sense of peace, of freedom, so intense it was painful, and with it, a feeling of devastating loss. These fragments were painting a picture of a man he didn't know, a life lived before the iron mask of the Alpha had been forged. He saw glimpses of a Kalen who could feel joy, who could love, who had not yet decided that emotion was a disease to be cured. The more he saw, the more the monstrous image of his captor began to complicate. He was still a monster, yes. The boy in the lab was proof of that. But he was a monster with a wound. One night, the connection flared with an unprecedented violence. Elian was jolted from a light sleep by a wave of pure, agonized grief, so powerful it felt like his own heart was being torn from his chest. He gasped, sitting bolt upright in bed, clutching his sternum. Tears streamed down his face, hot and foreign. He wasn't crying. Kalen was. Through the psychic static, a memory, clearer than any before, burst into his mind. He was not in his room anymore. He was in a small, bright infirmary. Sunlight, real sunlight, streamed through a window. He was younger, perhaps in his late teens. He was holding the hand of a boy in the bed. A boy with a face so much like his own, but softer, with wide, dark eyes. The boy was an Omega, his brother. The air was thick with the scent of sickness and the sweet, cloying smell of an Omega's heat gone wrong, a feverish, uncontrolled burn. The boy's skin was pale and damp, his breathing shallow. "It hurts, Kay," the boy whispered, his voice a thread of sound. "Make it stop." Kalen, the younger Kalen, squeezed his brother's hand, his face a mask of helpless anguish. "They're trying, Liam. They're trying." But the healers were shaking their heads. There was nothing they could do. The fever was too high, the cycle too violent. His body was consuming itself. The memory fast-forwarded in a nauseating blur of images, the frantic beeping of monitors, the scent turning acrid and sour, the final rattling breath, and then silence. A silence more profound and terrible than any in the archives. Kalen was standing by the bed, looking down at his brother's still form. The grief was a physical force, a storm that hollowed him out. And then, as the storm receded, something else took its place, a cold, hard resolve, a vow made in the face of unbearable pain. Never again. This would not happen again. He would fix the flaw. He would burn the chaos out of their very blood. He would build a world where this kind of pain, this kind of loss, was impossible. He would build the enclave. The vision shattered, and Elian was back in his bed, gasping for air, drenched in a cold sweat. The grief was still there, a dull ache in his chest, the phantom limb of Kalen's long-dead sorrow. He finally understood. The sterile city, the suppressants, the obsession with order, the brutal experiments in the lab. It was all born from this. It was the desperate, monstrous architecture of a broken heart. Kalen wasn't just a tyrant. He was a man who had tried to build a fortress around his own pain and had imprisoned the entire world inside it with him. He was not trying to cure a disease in their biology. He was trying to cut out a part of himself, the part that had loved and lost his brother, Liam. The boy in the cell wasn't just a subject. He was a surrogate, a ghost Kalen was trying to exorcise. Elian lay back on the pillows, his body trembling. The knowledge did not excuse what Kalen had done. It did not absolve him. But it changed everything. The lines were no longer so clear. The monster now had a face, and it was a face of unimaginable grief. And Elian, the prisoner, was the only one in the world who could see it. The connection between them was no longer just a thread to be pulled for his own survival. It was a bridge into the heart of his enemy's darkness, and he was standing right in the middle of it. The revelation settled into Elian like a stone, heavy and cold. It recontextualized every sterile surface, every dispassionate command, every flicker of frustration in Kalen's pale eyes. He was a man at war with memory, using an entire society as his shield. This knowledge armed Elian with a new, more dangerous kind of power, the power of understanding. He decided to change his strategy. Silence and passive resistance had gotten him nowhere. It was time to use the bridge between them, not as a weapon of attack, but as a scalpel. The next time Kalen visited, Elian was not waiting like a statue of defiance. He was sitting at the desk, the dark wood reflecting his pale, composed face. He wasn't working, but the simple act of being at the terminal was a concession, a change in the pattern that immediately put the alpha on edge. Kalen paused just inside the door, his gaze sharp and analytical, trying to process the new variable. "You've decided to be logical," Kalen stated, walking further into the room. It was not a question. "I've decided to be efficient," Elian replied, his voice calm. He met Kalen's gaze directly, holding it. He didn't flinch. He let a sliver of the shared memory, the scent of the infirmary, the feel of a cooling hand leak across the psychic connection. It was a subtle, targeted probe. Kalen stopped dead, his posture going rigid. A flicker of confusion, then pain, crossed his face before his mask of control slammed back down. It was so fast, a normal person would have missed it. But Elian saw it and felt it. I was reviewing pre-enclave medical archives, Elian continued, his tone conversational, clinical. Specifically, cases of cyclic cascade failure in omegas. It was a tragically common occurrence. He was using Kalen's own detached language, turning it back on him like a mirror. Kalen's hands clenched into fists at his sides. That data is irrelevant. It is a history of failure. We have moved beyond it. Have we? Elian asked softly. He stood up from the desk and walked towards the center of the room, closing the distance between them. He was no longer afraid of the Alpha's proximity. He understood the desolation it masked. Or are we just repeating it in a darker, more controlled way? You can't cure a memory, Kalen. He said the name, not Alpha. Kalen. The sound of it, spoken with such intimacy and accusation, was a physical blow. Kalen flinched, a bare, almost imperceptible movement. You know nothing, he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The glacial control was gone, replaced by the raw, feral anger Elian had seen in the lab. The alpha scent spiked in the room, a wave of pure dominance and threat. But Elian held his ground. He knew the anger was a shield for the grief that lay beneath. I know about Liam, he said, the name a key turning in a lock. The anger vanished, snuffed out like a candle flame, leaving behind a void of pure, stunned shock. Kalen stared at him, his face ashen, his pale eyes wide with a terrifying vulnerability. The fortress had been breached. The ghost was in the room. How? Kalen whispered, the word barely audible. It doesn't matter how, Elian said, his voice softening. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something akin to pity for this man. What matters is that this monument to your grief is failing. The experiment in the lab, this city, all of it. It's not a cure. It's a cage. And you're as trapped in it as I am, as he is. He gestured vaguely in the direction he knew the lab to be. Kalen looked utterly lost, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The architect of a perfect system faced with a flaw he could not comprehend. He looked at Elian not as a prisoner, but as an oracle, a terrifying spectre who had seen the core of his soul. What are you? Kalen breathed, the question filled with a sort of horrified awe. I'm the part you tried to cut out, Elian replied quietly. The memory, the feeling, the chaos you can't control. The confession, the confrontation, broke something between them. The dynamic of jailer and prisoner was shattered, replaced by something far more complicated and volatile. Kalen's visits stopped. For over a week, Elian was left in complete isolation. But the silence was different now. It was filled with the frantic, chaotic noise of Kalen's mind. The psychic connection, once a trickle, was now a flood. Elian was drowning in the Alpha's turmoil. The grief for Liam was a constant, dull ache, but now it was mixed with a maelstrom of new emotions, confusion, fear, and a deep, systemic dread. Something was going wrong, terribly wrong. Elian could feel it through the link, a sense of a system spiraling out of control. It was the experiment, the boy in the lab. The subject was degrading, just as Kalen had said, but it was worse than that. He was changing. Elian would get flashes of the lab, not as a memory, but in real time. The humming of the machinery was off-key, discordant. The blue light in the veins on the wall was flickering, pulsing erratically. And the scent that bled through the psychic link, was horrifying. It was no longer the scent of a terrified Omega. It was something else, something synthetic and monstrous, a smell of ozone, burned sugar, and wrongness. Kalen was losing control of his creation. The very thing he had engineered to eliminate primal chaos was becoming a vessel for a new, more terrifying version of it. The irony was so profound, it was almost elegant. The system of order was breeding its own unique form of chaos. One evening, a violent tremor shook the suite, strong enough to knock the books from the desk. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness for a full 10 seconds before emergency power kicked in, casting everything in a sickly red glow. The false window glitched, the perfect skyline dissolving into a screen of digital static. Through the link, Elian felt a surge of pure, undiluted panic from Kalen. Not the controlled frustration of before, but the raw terror of a man watching his world literally fall apart. The tremors continued, smaller ones now, a constant, unsettling vibration under the floor. The air of sterile peace in the spire was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of imminent collapse. Elian knew he couldn't just sit here and wait for the end. His fate was tied to Kalen's, and Kalen's world was ending. He went to the door of his suite, the seamless panel that had been his impassable barrier. He placed his palms flat against it. He closed his eyes and reached out through the connection, not with anger or accusation, but with a simple, desperate plea. Kalen. He pushed the single word, imbued with all the urgency and terror he felt, directly into the Alpha's mind. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a response, not a word, but a feeling, a jolt of acknowledgement, of shared panic. The lock on the door disengaged with a sharp, metallic click. The panel slid open. The hallway outside was bathed in the same red emergency light. It was empty. Alarms were beginning to blare in the distance, a low, rhythmic whoop-whoop that sounded like a dying heartbeat. He was free from his cage, and he had been released into a collapsing world. Elian stepped out of the suite, his soft-soled shoes silent on the corridor floor. The air outside was charged with tension, thick with the smell of hot metal and ozone. The distant alarms were a frantic pulse, counting down to a catastrophe he couldn't yet see. He had no plan, no destination. He was simply moving, drawn by the psychic pull of Kalen's panic, a moth drawn to a collapsing star. The spire, once a monument to silent, orderly perfection, was now a chaotic hive. Beta functionaries and a few lower-ranked alphas hurried through the corridors, their faces tight with anxiety, their movements precise but edged with fear. They paid him no mind, his simple grey tunic making him invisible, just another cog in a machine that was rapidly shaking itself to pieces. He followed the psychic thread, the signal of Kalen's distress growing stronger, leading him upward, back towards the place where it had all begun. Level 99. The lift that had once carried him up in serene silence now shuddered and groaned, its movements jerky. He was alone inside, the red emergency lighting painting the mirrored walls in strokes of blood. When the doors opened on the top level, he was met not with the blinding white room of his first visit, but with a scene of controlled chaos. Several of the Enclave's top technicians, their faces pale and grim, were gathered around a central console, their fingers flying across holographic interfaces that flickered and glitched. And in the center of it all, Standing before the dark circular lens that looked into the lab was Kalen. He had shed his command jacket again. He was barking orders, his voice tight and strained, the calm facade completely gone. He was no longer the architect of a perfect world, but a desperate engineer trying to prevent a reactor meltdown. He sensed Elian's presence before he saw him. He turned, his pale eyes finding Elian across the room. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a grim, weary recognition. The time for pretense was over. "The containment field is fluctuating," Kalen said, his voice flat, exhausted. He gestured to the dark lens. "The energy readings are impossible." Elian walked to his side and looked through the portal. The lab beyond was a nightmare of strobing light and arcing electricity. The pulsing veins on the walls were now a violent, convulsive purple. The machinery sparked and smoked, and the glass of the containment cell, was spiderwebbed with cracks, a deep, resonant hum emanating from within. He couldn't see the Omega Boy clearly through the chaos, only a writhing shape in the center of the storm. The monstrous synthetic scent was stronger than ever, seeping even through the thick portal glass. "What is it?" Elian asked, his voice low. "What did you create?" "A suppression matrix," Kalen answered, his eyes fixed on the impending disaster. "A biological agent coupled with a psychic dampener. It was designed to sever the connection to the primal hindbrain, to eliminate the cycle, to create stability." His voice was hollow, a confession of his ultimate failure. "But it didn't sever it. It mutated it. It fed on the instinctual energy, twisting it, amplifying it into that." He didn't have a name for the thing in the cell. It was the physical embodiment of his hubris. "It's developing a psychic field of its own," a technician called out, her voice trembling. "It's pushing back. I can't reinforce the dampeners." Through his own connection with Kalen, Elian could feel it. A third presence, a mind of pure, chaotic instinct, a screaming void of rage and hunger. It was pushing against his own senses, a wave of psychic noise that made his teeth ache. "It wants out," Elian said. Kalen nodded, his face grim. "The moment the containment field fails, it will vent into the spire's primary systems. It will spread through the network. A psychic plague. It will do to the entire city what it did to him. It would turn them all into monsters. The ultimate terrible irony." A tremor, stronger than any before, rocked the spire. A collective shout of alarm went up from the technicians. On the other side of the glass, a large crack splintered across the containment cell. The humming intensified to a deafening shriek. "Manual override is failing," another technician yelled. 5 minutes to total system collapse." Panic began to set in. One of the technicians abandoned his post, turning to flee. "Hold your positions," Kalen roared, the alpha command in his voice cutting through the fear. But it was fraying. He was losing them. He was losing everything. He looked at Elian, and in his eyes, for the first time, was a look of utter defeat. The man who had solutions for everything had run out of answers. It was then that Elian understood his own role in this. He was not just a witness, not just a prisoner. He was the anomaly, the unpredictable variable, the one thing in Kalen's world that did not operate on logic. He was the only one who had a connection to the man at the heart of the storm. "Your command won't work on it," Elian said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Logic won't work. You can't fight instinct with data." Kalen stared at him. "What are you proposing?" "You built a system to suppress feeling. Elian said, stepping closer, his gaze locked with Kalen's. But you and I, we have a bridge between us, a bridge of pure feeling. Maybe we can use it for something other than hurting each other. It was a wild, desperate idea, born of the chaos around them, to use their strange, intimate psychic bond as a weapon. Or not a weapon, a conduit. Kalen's mind, the mind of the system's creator, and Elian's, the mind that could feel its heart. How? Kalen asked, the single word, a surrender. Connect me, Elian said. Directly. Patch me into the dampening field, not to suppress it, to communicate with it. It was insane. To open his mind to that screaming void. It could destroy him. It probably would. But the alternative was the destruction of everything. Kalen stared at him, his analytical mind warring with the desperation of the moment. He saw the resolve in Elian's eyes. He saw the strange, terrifying courage of the Omega he had locked away. He made a decision. Do it, he barked at the lead technician. Link the scribe's biosignature to the primary console. Route it through my command authority. Give him access. The technician looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. Sir, the feedback will kill him. Do it, Kalen commanded. He turned back to Elian, his expression a complex mix of fear and something else, something that looked almost like hope. He reached out and grabbed Elian's arm, his grip hard, grounding. If this works, if you can reach it, what do you think you'll find? Elian looked at the cracking cell, at the storm of monstrous energy within. He thought of the boy, the terrified Omega, who had been sacrificed on the altar of Kalen's grief. He was still in there, somewhere, buried beneath the chaos. A prisoner, Elian said quietly. Just like me. The technician, her hands trembling, placed a neural interface against Elian's temple. It was cold, a small circle of metal that promised a terrifying union. Linking Scribe 7B to the suppression matrix, she announced, her voice strained over the cacophony. Routing through Alpha Command. Now. The world dissolved. It was not a gentle fading, but a violent tearing. One moment he was standing in the chaotic control room, Kalen's hand a solid anchor on his arm. The next, he was plunged into a maelstrom of pure, unadulterated sensation. It was the psychic equivalent of being thrown into the heart of a star. The screaming of the creature, the entity Kalen had created, was an omnipresent, deafening roar in his mind. It was a sound of pure agony, of rage, of a billion conflicting instincts firing at once. He felt his own consciousness begin to fray, his sense of self dissolving into the psychic static. He was nothing, a single drop of water in a tidal wave of madness. Kalen. The thought was a lifeline. He clung to it, to the anchor of the Alpha's presence, which was a steady, focused point of cold logic in the chaos. He could feel Kalen's mind linked to his, experiencing a muted, filtered version of the onslaught. He could feel the Alpha's terror, but also his focus, his analytical brain trying to map the storm. Find the I, Kalen's thought came, not as a word, but as a concept, a directive. Find the source. Elian pushed deeper, past the screaming layers of rage and pain. He let the current take him, not fighting it, but flowing with it. The creature's mind was a landscape of broken mirrors, each one reflecting a distorted image of primal fear. Fear of confinement, fear of pain, fear of the self. It was a prison of pure sensation, and in the very center of it all, he found it, a tiny, flickering light, a consciousness curled into a ball like an embryo. It was the boy, Liam, No, not Liam. The Omega from the cell. He was there, lost in the heart of the monster Kalen had built around him. Elian reached for him, pushing a single, simple feeling through the storm. Not a command, not a plea, just recognition. I see you. The screaming in his head faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of curiosity from the beast. He was a new sensation, something other than pain and stimulus. Elian pushed again, this time sharing a feeling of his own. He sent the memory of the silence in the archives, the weight of the processed air, the feeling of being a ghost. He sent his own loneliness, his own confinement. I was a prisoner too, a new sensation from the creature. Confusion. It had never known anything but the lab, the wires, the pain. It didn't understand. The screaming started to build again, the brief lull ending. It was going to overwhelm him. It's not enough, Kalen's thought came, sharp with desperation. It doesn't understand your experience. You have to use mine. Elian felt a jolt as Kalen deliberately opened a deeper channel between them. He wasn't just an anchor anymore. He was an open book. Kalen was feeding his own memories, his own pain, directly into Elian. The grief for Liam, raw and unfiltered. The moment of his brother's death. The cold resolve. The decades of lonely, obsessive work. The terrible, crushing weight of his failure. It was an agony so profound it nearly shattered Elian's mind. But through the pain, he understood. He had to show the creature not just confinement, but the reason for it. He took Kalen's grief, that terrible, world-breaking sorrow, and he wrapped it around the image of the boy in the cell. He projected it all into the storm. This is why, he sent, the thought a wave of pure, shared agony. This is the pain that built your cage. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The psychic screaming stopped. It was replaced by a sound of pure, heart-rending sorrow. The creature, the monster, was weeping. In the control room, the shrieking from the lab cut out, replaced by a low, mournful hum. The violent, pulsing light softened, the arcs of electricity dying down. The spider-webbed cracks on the cell ceased to spread. The creature was feeling Kalen's grief as its own. It was a shared trauma, a terrible, profound empathy between the creator and the created, with Elian as the bridge. It understood now, not logically, but emotionally. It understood that it was born of pain, and its own existence was a source of that same pain. The mournful hum began to fade. The energy readings on the technicians' consoles plummeted. The entity was letting go. It was unmaking itself, dissolving back into the primal energy from which it was formed, choosing non-existence over a life of shared agony. The light in the lab dimmed, faded, and then went out completely, leaving only the red glow of the emergency systems. Silence, a profound, absolute silence descended upon the control room. The technicians stared at their consoles, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. The threat was gone. Elian felt the psychic connection sever. The sudden absence of the storm, of Kalen's mind, of the creature's sorrow, left him in a silent void. The strain of it all hit him at once. The world tilted, the red lights blurring. Kalen's hand, still on his arm, was the only thing holding him up. He sagged against the alpha, his strength completely gone. Kalen caught him, his arm wrapping around Elian's back, supporting his weight. It wasn't the gesture of a jailer, but of an ally, of a partner. Elian looked up at him. Kalen's face was pale, his expression shattered. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, a silver line in the red light. He was not the alpha of the Enclave. He was not the architect of order. He was just a man, stripped bare, his life's work undone by the very emotion he had tried to eradicate. "It's over," Elian whispered, his voice barely a breath. Kalen looked down at him, his pale eyes holding a universe of ruin and a flicker of something new. Gratitude, respect. "Yes," Kalen said, his voice thick. "It's over." The spire was broken, the system was shattered, and in the ruins the two of them stood together, bound by a secret and a sorrow that had almost torn their world apart. The aftermath was quiet chaos. The spire's structural integrity was compromised, and the Enclave's command structure was decapitated. Kalen's secret was no longer containable. The events on level 99, the system-wide alerts, the psychic shockwave that had subtly touched every mind in the city. It was a catastrophic failure that could not be redacted. In the hours that followed the silence, Kalen moved with a strange, detached purpose. He wasn't the Alpha anymore, issuing commands. He was a man performing a final duty. He oversaw the evacuation of the spire, his voice calm and measured as he coordinated with his stunned subordinates. He sealed level 99 permanently, entombing his failure, the ghost of his brother, and the sacrifice of the boy in the cell. He never spoke of what happened in the lab again. Elian was no longer a prisoner. The door to his suite stood open. The world was his to enter, but he did not leave. He sat on the couch in the silent room, the false window now dark and lifeless, and watched Kalen work through the open door, a distant figure moving through the red-lit corridors. He was exhausted, his mind a bruised, tender thing after the psychic ordeal. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean. When the spire was finally empty, save for the two of them, Kalen returned to the suite. He looked older, the lines on his face deeper. The black uniform seemed to hang on him now, a costume for a role he no longer played. He stopped in the doorway, looking at Elian. The silence between them was no longer tense or hostile. It was heavy with everything that had happened, with everything that had been revealed and destroyed. "The council has been convened," Kalen said, his voice toneless. "They will strip me of my authority. There will be an inquiry. They will want to know what happened." He looked at Elian. "They will want to speak to you." Elian said nothing. The council, the faceless arbiters of the Enclave's order. They would want answers. They would want a scapegoat. "What will you tell them?" Kalen asked. It was the first time he had ever asked Elian for anything. It was a question of profound vulnerability. Elian thought for a long moment. He could tell them everything. He could expose Kalen's grief-fueled monstrosity, the decades of lies, the brutal experiment. He could destroy him completely. It would be justice, but looking at the broken man in the doorway, he saw no triumph in that. He saw only more pain, more ruin. "There was a system failure," Elian said, his voice quiet but clear. "A flaw in the spire's energy core created a feedback loop. It caused a localized psychic event. You contained it. You saved the city." Kalen stared at him, his expression unreadable. He was offering him a lie, an escape, a way to reframe his catastrophe as a heroic act, a way to preserve some semblance of the order he so cherished, even as his own role in it was ending. "Why?" Kalen asked, the word rough with emotion he could no longer suppress. "The truth." "They wouldn't understand the truth," Elian said. "It was only part of the reason. The other part was more complex, something he didn't have the words for. It was about the shared agony, the bridge between them. You do not destroy the person who has shown you the core of their soul, even if that soul is a dark and twisted thing. The Enclave needs a story, Elian continued. It needs to believe the system works, even when its architect fails. Giving them the real truth would cause more chaos than that thing in the lab ever could. He was thinking like Kalen now. He was thinking in systems and consequences. The irony was not lost on him. Kalen walked fully into the room and sank into the chair opposite the couch. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. The great Alpha Kalen, the architect of a world without feeling, was finally completely broken. Elian watched him, feeling not pity, not anger, but a strange, quiet sense of finality. The transition of power was swift and clinical. Kalen was retired, his heroic containment of the energy failure, his final act. He was given a quiet residence in a distant sector of the city, erased from public life as efficiently as a redacted line of text. The Enclave, ever resilient, recalibrated. A new alpha was chosen by the council, a bland technocrat who would maintain the system. The official story held. The citizens went on with their placid, orderly lives, unaware of how close they had come to a monster of their own making. Elian left the spire. He walked out into the city, the air still tasting of recycled perfection. He was free. He returned to his small Spartan quarters. He went back to the Grand Archives. The silence was the same, the smell of ozone and dormant data unchanged. But he was different. The world was no longer muted. His suppressants had been destroyed in the psychic feedback, and he had not replaced them. For the first time in years, he could smell the faint, lingering scent of the beta librarians, the sharp tang of the cleaning drones. He could feel the subtle ebb and flow of his own body, the gentle, natural tides he had been taught to fear. He was no longer a ghost. He was a person. Weeks passed. He worked. He ate. He slept. Life had a rhythm, but it was a new one. It was his own. But there was an absence, a silence in his mind where the chaotic, intrusive presence of Kalen had been. The connection was gone, severed by distance and the end of their shared crisis. He found he missed it. He missed the terrible intimacy, the raw, unfiltered truth of it. One evening, after his shift, he stood before the city's transit map. He looked at the designation for the remote sector where Kalen now lived. He didn't know why he was going. He just knew he had to. Kalen's new residence was modest, identical to the thousands of others in the block. Elian stood before the door, his heart a quiet, steady drum. He raised his hand and pressed the chime. The door slid open. Kalen stood there. He wore a simple grey tunic, the same as Elian's. He was no one, just a man. His pale eyes widened slightly in surprise. They stood in silence for a long moment, the air thick with the memory of the spire, of the lab, of the shared, terrible intimacy. Elian, Kalen said. It was just a name. Elian looked past him, into the small, sparsely furnished room. There was a window, a real one, looking out onto a small, sterile courtyard. On the windowsill sat a single, small pot. In it, a single white flower was beginning to bloom. It was a fragile, impossible thing, a tiny piece of the past pushing its way into the sterile present, a ghost of a field under a real blue sky. Elian's gaze moved from the flower back to Kalen's face. The fortress was gone. The monster was gone. All that was left was the man and his wound. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Kalen. And Elian, for reasons he could not yet name, had come to see him. He stepped across the threshold and the door slid shut behind him, sealing them not in a prison, but in a quiet, uncertain space where a new, unknown story could begin. Outside, for the first time in months, the atmospheric ceiling projectors faltered, and a light, cleansing rain began to fall on the city of glass and steel.